All right, everyone, welcome back to LexTalk. You know we're all about English and linguistics here, right?
That's right. And especially here in Thailand, how we use English, how we think about it.
And we are back for Season 3.
Episode 9. Time flies when you're having fun with linguistics.
It really does.
Yeah.
This season, we've been exploring this fascinating connection between culture, communication, and language.
And today, oh boy, do we have a topic that I know a lot of you have probably experienced firsthand.
I think we all have. We're talking about those moments, when you're watching an English movie or reading a book.
Or even just chatting with someone.
Right. And suddenly, bam, you hit this wall, this cultural reference that just whooshes right over your head.
It can be so confusing. You're left there feeling like, wait, what did they just say?
I know, right? It's like everyone else is in on some inside joke that you completely missed.
And it happens all the time. Historical events you've never heard of.
Weird sayings that make absolutely no sense if you take them literally.
Or even just pop culture references that are completely outside your world.
Like that time I tried to explain a meme to my grandma.
Oh, I can only imagine. And it's not just about feeling a bit lost. These cultural references are everywhere in English, and sometimes not getting them can make it really hard to understand what's going on or to connect with people on a deeper level.
So today, let's dive deep into this, shall we? We want to figure out why these references are such a big deal in English.
And more importantly, we'll explore some practical ways to decode them so you can avoid those head-scratching moments and really get what's being said.
Exactly. Now, before we get into all the nitty-gritty details, let's start with the basics. What do we actually mean when we talk about a cultural reference?
Well, think of it this way. A cultural reference is like a little package of meaning that's understood within a specific cultural group.
It's like a shortcut, right? A way of communicating something quickly because everyone in that culture already gets it.
Precisely. It could be a word, a phrase, a concept, or even just an idea. And it's based on shared knowledge, experiences, history, all those things that bind a culture together.
So someone outside that culture might hear it and be completely clueless, like, what on earth are they talking about?
Right, because they don't have the same cultural background or haven't been exposed to those same things.
Our research actually found that these cultural references tend to fall into a few main categories, don't they?
Yes, they do. One category is historical events and figures. Like mentioning the Watergate scandal in the U.S.
Right. Instantly brings up a whole set of images and emotions for people who know that history.
Then there are idioms and proverbs, those little sayings like, don't cry over spilled milk.
Those are tricky. They often don't make any literal sense, do they?
Not at all. You have to understand the underlying cultural wisdom or message they convey.
Pop culture is another huge one, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially with movies, TV shows, music, and all that. A phrase like, may the force be with you.
Classic. Star Wars, of course.
Exactly. Instant recognition for fans. And then there are the more subtle cultural references like social customs and humor.
Oh, humor is a minefield, isn't it? What's funny in one culture can fall completely flat in another.
It really can. Think about British humor, for example. That dry, understated wit, sometimes sarcastic, it can be really hard to grasp if you're not used to it.
And sometimes, even when you know what a cultural reference is supposed to mean, it still throws you off, doesn't it?
It does. I remember reading this article once and it said something like, this meeting is turning into a Shakespearean tragedy. Now, if you know a bit about Shakespeare, you can picture it, right? The drama, the conflict, the potential for things to go very wrong.
If you've never read or seen any Shakespeare, that comparison just goes straight over your head.
Exactly. It's just a bunch of words that don't really tell you anything.
So, okay, we've talked about what cultural references are, but why exactly are they such a big deal? Why do they trick us up so much when we're learning or using English? What do you think?
Well, I think one of the biggest reasons is that language and history are deeply intertwined. A culture's past shapes its language in so many ways.
It's like the language carries echoes of everything that came before it.
Precisely. And if you don't know the history, you miss the echo. Think about so many English idioms, those sayings we were talking about earlier. Many of them come from specific historical events or stories from the Bible.
Or from famous writers like Shakespeare.
Exactly. Crossing the Rubicon, for instance. That means making an irreversible decision, a point of no return. But that meaning comes directly from the story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River, which was a huge turning point in Roman history.
Without knowing that history, the phrase loses its impact.
It becomes just a collection of words. And then on top of history, we have the massive influence of pop culture and media, especially in our modern, hyper-connected world.
It's everywhere, isn't it? Movies, TV shows, music, social media, they all feed into how we speak and what we consider current English.
They absolutely do. A phrase like, I'll be back, which originally came from the Terminator movie, is now just a common way of saying you'll return soon. And everyone gets the reference, even if they haven't seen the movie.
But the tricky part is that pop culture moves so fast. New trends, new memes, new slang are constantly emerging.
Especially online. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. Even for native English speakers, it can be hard to keep up.
I know. I feel like I'm constantly Googling new slang terms just to understand what my students are talking about these days. And then there's humor, which we touched on before. Our research really highlighted how tricky English humor can be for language learners, especially sarcasm.
Oh, sarcasm is a whole other level. It relies so much on understanding the speaker's tone and intent. You have to know that they're saying the opposite of what they mean.
It's like you need to decode not just the words, but the whole cultural context behind them. Like when someone says, oh, that's just great, when something bad happens.
Right. A non-native speaker might think they're being serious, and that can lead to some awkward misunderstandings.
And then, to make things even more complicated, there are all these regional variations in English, right? What's considered a common reference in one English-speaking country might be completely unfamiliar in another.
Absolutely. English isn't a monolithic thing. It's spoken in so many different parts of the world, and each region has its own cultural flavor, its own unique set of references and expressions.
It's like having different dialects, almost.
In a way, it is. For example, American English is full of metaphors and idioms from baseball, like saying something came out of left field to mean it was
Why,
unexpected.
or hitting a home run to mean you were successful.
Exactly. But if you've never watched baseball, those phrases might not make much sense. And then you have British English, with its own unique sayings and references, some tied to their history and institutions.
Like the Australian expression, no worries, mate.
Perfect example. That's not just about saying everything's okay. It conveys a whole cultural attitude of laid-back reassurance, that kind of Aussie spirit. So yeah, learning one variety of English doesn't mean you'll automatically understand all the others. It's a constant learning process.
It sounds pretty overwhelming, to be honest, like trying to navigate a maze with hidden traps and constantly shifting walls. But there must be ways to get better at understanding these cultural references, right? Our research did point to some helpful strategies, didn't it?
It did. And the good news is that anyone can use them, regardless of your English level.
So where do we even begin? What's the first step?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is to immerse yourself in English as much as possible. But not just any English. Immerse yourself in a variety of English from different cultures.
So we're talking movies, TV shows, music,
YouTube. It's amazing. You can find creators from all over the English-speaking world.
books, news articles.
Podcasts, like this one.
Of course, of course. But the key is to really pay attention to the language they're using, to the slang, to the idioms, to those little cultural nuggets that are sprinkled throughout.
And don't be passive. If you hear a reference you don't understand, jot it down. Look it up later. Ask a native speaker to explain it.
That's such good advice. I know sometimes it can feel a bit embarrassing to admit you don't understand something.
I get it. But trust me, most native speakers are happy to help. They're usually quite fascinated by the things that non-native speakers find confusing or interesting about their language.
And what about those times when we're not in a position to ask someone right away? Are there resources we can use to decode those confusing cultural references?
Absolutely. We live in the age of information. There are tons of online dictionaries specifically for slang and idioms. Urban Dictionary is a great one.
A simple Google search can often reveal the history or the pop culture origin of a phrase.
Exactly. And sometimes just reading the phrase in a few different contexts can help you figure out what it means.
So it's about being an active learner, being curious, and not being afraid to ask questions.
Precisely. But beyond just figuring things out in the moment, it's also really helpful to build your overall knowledge of Western history and culture.
That's where so many of these English references come from, right?
It is. Knowing a bit about major historical events, important figures from literature and history, even iconic pop culture figures can give you a framework for understanding all sorts of references.
It's like having a mental map to help you navigate the cultural landscape.
Exactly. And on that map, you can start to plot those idioms and slang terms you come across. Keep a notebook, make flashcards, whatever works for you. But the more you expose yourself to them, the more you'll start to recognize them and understand how they're used.
And technology can be a big help here, can't it?
Absolutely. AI-powered translation tools are getting so good these days. Many of them can now explain tricky phrases or even identify the origin of a cultural reference.
And some language learning apps are starting to incorporate more content on slang, idioms, and cultural context. So if you're already using those apps, definitely explore those features.
And here's a fun fact from our research. Learners who actively engage with English pop culture tend to have better listening skills and adapt to the culture more quickly.
So watching those English movies and TV shows is not just entertainment, it's actually helping you learn.
It is, it's all connected. So, to sum it all up, cultural references are like these hidden threads that run through the fabric of the English language. They're everywhere, and they add richness, humor, and depth to how we communicate.
But they can also be really confusing for language learners, especially if you're not familiar with the culture behind them.
The good news is that understanding these references is a skill you can develop, just like any other language skill. It takes time, effort, and a bit of curiosity, but it's definitely worth it.
Now, we'd love to hear from you, our amazing listeners, especially those of you here in Thailand who are navigating the world of English and all its cultural quirks. What's the strangest or most confusing phrase or reference you've ever come across in English? Head over to the comments section and share your stories with us. We're always eager to hear about your learning adventures.
And speaking of adventures, in our next deep dive, we're going to explore the fascinating world of pragmatics in conversation. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes say one thing but mean something completely different?
Oh, all the time.
We're going to talk about how to read between the lines, how to understand those implied meanings, which is another crucial part of mastering English.
Don't miss it. And to make sure you don't miss any of our future deep dives into the world of English language and linguistics, don't forget to follow LexTalk on all our platforms.
You can find us on our website, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, SoundCloud, and Spotify. Just search for @LexTalk Podcast.
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Until next time,
Let's talk, let's learn.
let's Lex Talk.